Welcome back, and thank you for tuning in to Cheating Stories Hub. We appreciate every single one of you. We'd love to know what part of the world are you watching from right now. Let us know in the comments now. Let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Perfect Illusion. The grand hall shimmered with a golden glow, the chandeliers casting a warm light over polished floors and elegantly arranged tables. Everything about the evening was meticulously planned. After years of sacrifices, sleepless nights, and relentless hard work, this was the culmination of it all, a family reunion to celebrate love, success, and the bonds that held us together. I'd envisioned this night as perfect, a moment where all the pieces of our family would come together seamlessly. My eldest son, Ryan, stood tall in the center of the room, exuding charisma in his tailored navy blue suit. At 32, he was everything I could have hoped for in a son, ambitious, accomplished, and admired by everyone. People gravitated toward him as though he were the sun, their laughter orbiting around his sharp wit and easy charm. To Ryan's left stood my daughter, Lily, the epitome of elegance and poise. At 28, her achievements shone just as brightly. Her hard work had earned her a position in one of the most respected firms in the city, and she wore her success effortlessly. She carried herself with a kind of confidence that left little room for doubt. She was a force to be reckoned with. And then there was Michael, my youngest. At 22, he lingered near the bar, a shadow among the gleaming stars of his siblings. His shoulders slumped, his eyes cast downward, as if he were trying to disappear into the background. Michael's struggles were no secret. He hadn't yet found his path. My wife, Emily, often voiced her frustrations about his lack of direction, but I believed in him. Beneath the weight of his insecurity, I saw a kind soul with potential waiting to be realized. As the evening unfolded, I watched my family from a distance, savoring the sight of them together. I felt a sense of pride, even in Michael's hesitance. I believe he simply needed time and support, things I was determined to give him. The evening was in full swing when Ryan's toast came, pulling me out of my thoughts. He stood at the head of the room, raising his glass with that signature confident smile. The room quieted, every eye on him. To my parents, he began, his voice warm and steady, for their unwavering support and sacrifices, for showing us what family truly means. The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the hall with an energy that lifted my spirits. But Ryan wasn't finished. He glanced around the room, his smile sharpening into something almost predatory. And he added, pausing for effect, for giving us all the best of their genes. Well, most of us. The room rippled with polite laughter, but the comment struck me like a blade. My smile froze as I glanced toward Michael, whose face flushed crimson. His hand gripped the edge of the bar, his knuckles white. Ryan's gaze lingered on him for a moment too long before he turned back to the crowd, basking in the cheers that followed. I felt my stomach churn. It wasn't just the jab at Michael. It was the way Ryan had said it, the calculated edge in his tone. Something about it felt too deliberate, too pointed, as though his words carried a meaning that only he understood. The rest of the evening continued in a blur. Guests mingled, glasses clinked, and laughter echoed through the hall, but I couldn't shake the unease Ryan's words had stirred in me. The best of their genes. The phrase played on a loop in my mind, a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious evening. As the guests began to leave, I found myself watching Ryan more closely. His confidence, usually so effortless, now felt unsettling, sharper, more calculated. What had prompted his comment? Why would he choose such a moment to make it? By the time the last guest departed, Emily had already retreated upstairs, claiming a headache. Left alone in the dimly lit dining room, I stared at the remnants of the evening, half-empty wine glasses, crumpled napkins, and plates of untouched desserts. I poured myself a glass of scotch, the burr of the alcohol doing little to steady the storm brewing inside me. My gaze drifted to the family photos lining the walls, images frozen in time, birthdays, graduations, vacations. They were reminders of the sacrifices I had made for this family. I had put my career on hold, passed up opportunities, and endured financial strain, all to give them the life I never had. And yet, for the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into my mind. Ryan's comment wasn't just a joke. It wasn't merely a playful jab at his younger brother. There was something deeper, something deliberate in the way he had said it. As I stared at the photographs, the weight of his words pressed harder on my chest. What if this wasn't about Michael at all? What if it was aimed at me? The thought lodged itself in my mind, impossible to ignore. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, the overthinking of a tired mind. But the unease refused to let go, buzzing like static in the back of my mind. Later that night, I decided to check on Michael. His bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I could see him sitting on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. I knocked softly before stepping inside. "Hey, kiddo," I said gently. "You okay?" He let out a bitter laugh, his voice muffled. "Do I look okay?" I sat beside him, the bed creaking under our weight. "Ryan can be an ass sometimes," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "You know, he didn't mean it." Michael turned to me, his eyes red-rimmed. "You think that was a joke?" "He knows, Dad. He knows everything." My stomach dropped. "Knows what?" Michael shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I overheard him talking to Lily a few weeks ago. They've been digging into family history or something. He said something about the truth always coming out. I didn't think much of it at the time, but tonight he trailed off, his voice cracking. I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. What truth, Michael? What is he talking about? He looked at me, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. "I don't know, Dad. But whatever it is, it's about us. About this family." A cold wave of dread washed over me. Ryan's words, his smug smile, the way he had commanded the room, it all felt like a performance. He wasn't just showing off tonight. He was sending a message. "Go to bed," I said, finally standing up. "We'll figure this out." As I walked out of Michael's room, my mind raced. I needed answers, but I couldn't confront Ryan, not yet. He wanted me to. He was waiting for it, relishing the thought of pulling me into whatever trap he had set. No, I had to find out what he knew before he could use it against me. By the time I reached my bedroom, Emily was already asleep, her back turned to me. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, the weight of the evening pressing down on me. Whatever was happening, I could feel it. Something was unraveling, and I was at the center of it. For the first time in years, I felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, the gnawing edge of doubt. And as I stared into the darkness of the room, I realized that this moment, Ryan's toast, Michael's words, was only the beginning. Chapter 2: Cracks Beneath the Surface. The house was silent when I woke the next morning, the kind of oppressive silence that amplified every creak of the floorboards and every soft sigh of the wind outside. Emily was still asleep, her breathing steady, and even as she lay with her back to me. I sat up, my mind clouded with the remnants of last night's revelations. Michael's words had been clear. Ryan knew something, and whatever it wasn't just a passing discovery. It had weight, enough to make Ryan lash out in front of everyone. And his confidence, the smugness in his tone, suggested he wasn't afraid of the consequences. That made it even worse. By the time I made it downstairs, the remnants of the reunion were still scattered across the dining room. The crumpled napkins and empty glasses looked like the aftermath of a battlefield, a visual reminder of the fractures beneath our family's polished surface. I poured myself a coffee and stared out of the window, the dull hum of unease still buzzing in my chest. Ryan's words replayed in my mind, the best of their genes. The phrase felt like an accusation, though I couldn't yet piece together what he was accusing me of. What did he know? And why had he chosen last night, of all nights, to say it? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Emily appeared in the doorway, her expression guarded. She wore a robe pulled tightly around her, and her hair was still tousled from sleep. She lingered for a moment before stepping into the kitchen. "Morning," she said softly, her tone neutral. "Morning." I didn't look at her, my focus still on the window. She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, her eyes flickering toward me. "You were up late last night." "I couldn't sleep," I replied, keeping my voice even. Emily hesitated, as though weighing whether to push further. "Is this about Ryan's toast?" Her question caught me off guard, but I didn't let it show. Why would it be? She set her cup down, her fingers tracing the rim. "Paul, you know how Ryan is. He has a sharp tongue. but he doesn't mean half of what he says. I turned to face her, my gaze steady. That wasn't just a sharp tongue, Emily. He meant every word. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned away, busying herself with tidying the counter. The avoidance was obvious, and it only fueled my suspicions. Emily, I said, my voice firm. What aren't you telling me? She froze, her back still to me. You're overthinking this, she said finally, her voice tight. Ryan's always been like this. You know that. I stepped closer, my tone hardening. I don't think this is just Ryan being Ryan. I think he knows something. And I think you do, too. She turned to face me, her eyes narrowing. Don't start, Paul. Not today. Her defensiveness was answer enough. There was something she wasn't saying, something she was afraid to admit. But I knew better than to press her now. Emily had always been good at deflecting, at steering conversations away from uncomfortable truths. If I pushed too hard, she'd only shut down further. Instead, I left the kitchen, my coffee forgotten. If Emily wasn't going to give me answers, I'd have to find them myself. Later that morning, I found myself in my study, staring at the family photos on my desk. The images, once a source of pride, now felt like relics of a life I no longer understood. Each smile, each moment frozen in time, seemed tainted by the doubt creeping into my thoughts. Michael's words from the night before echoed in my mind. He knows, Dad. He knows everything. But what did Ryan know? And how? I reached for my phone, scrolling through the photos from the reunion. Most of them were candid shots of the guests. Laughter, raised glasses, moments of joy. But one image caught my attention. Ryan standing between Emily and Lily, his hand resting on Emily's shoulder. His smile was a fraction too wide, his eyes sharp, almost mocking. It was subtle, but now that I was looking for it, I couldn't unsee it. Ryan wasn't just celebrating last night. He was sending a message, and I had been too distracted to catch it in the moment. The uneasy hum in my chest grew louder. By afternoon, I decided to confront Michael. He had been the one to bring this to my attention, and I needed to know what else he had overheard. I found him in the garage, tinkering with an old bike he had been trying to repair for months. Michael, I said, leaning against the doorway. He glanced up, his expression guarded. What's up? I stepped inside, my tone careful. About what you said last night. About Ryan. I need you to tell me everything you know. Michael sighed, setting down his tools. I already told you. He was talking to Lily about family stuff, genealogy, or whatever. He said something about the truth coming out, but I didn't think it was a big deal. Did he say why he was looking into genealogy? I pressed. Michael shook his head. No, but it was weird. He was acting smug, like he knew something no one else did. The pieces were starting to form, though they were still blurry and incomplete. If Ryan had been digging into genealogy, then this wasn't just about Michael. This was about all of us, about the family as a whole. Thanks, Michael, I said, turning to leave. Dad, he called after me. What's going on? I paused, my hand on the doorframe. I'm not sure yet, but I'll figure it out. That evening, I found Emily in the living room, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. I sat down across from her, my gaze steady. We need to talk, I said. Her eyes flickered up, wary. About what? Right. Last night. Whatever he knows. Emily tensed, her fingers tightening around her phone. Paul, you're overreacting. You always do this. You take one comment and turn it into a conspiracy. This isn't just a comment, Emily, I snapped. He's been digging into family history. He's been looking for something. And I need to know why. Her silence spoke volumes. She didn't deny it. She didn't even argue. She simply stared at me, her expression unreadable. What does he know? I demanded, my voice rising. I don't know, she said finally, her voice trembling. I don't know what he's found. But there's something to find, isn't there? I pressed. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't answer. Instead, she stood and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the questions that had begun to consume me. That night, as I sat in my study, I found myself staring at an old family album. Each photo, each memory, felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't know how to solve. The family I thought I had built now felt like a fragile facade, one that Ryan was determined to shatter. I didn't know what he had found, but I knew one thing for certain. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out. And when it did, everything would change. Chapter 3: The First Fractures. The following day dawned heavy with an unshakable tension, the kind that lingered in the air and seeped into every corner of the house. Emily was uncharacteristically quiet during breakfast, and I couldn't decide if her silence was guilt, fear, or defiance. Michael had retreated to his room, avoiding everyone, while Lily hadn't yet surfaced from hers. Ryan, however, was the focus of my thoughts. Whatever game he was playing, I needed to understand it before he made his next move. His confidence at the reunion had been unsettling, but his silence since then was even worse. It felt calculated, like he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. By mid-morning, I decided to start with Lily. She had always been the more empathetic of the three, the one who wore her emotions openly. If anyone could shed light on what Ryan had been up to, it was her. I found her in a sunroom, scrolling through her phone, the soft morning light casting a glow over her face. She looked up as I entered, her expression wary but curious. "Morning, Dad," she said, setting her phone aside. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile as I sat across from her. "How are you feeling after the reunion?" She shrugged, her tone nonchalant. "It was fine. A little tense toward the end, but that's Ryan for you. He always knows how to stir the pot." Her words were light, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She was holding something back. "Did Ryan say anything to you before his toast?" I asked carefully. Lily frowned, her brows knitting together. "Not really. I mean, he was talking about family stuff, how important it is to know where you come from, that kind of thing. He's been weirdly into genealogy lately." Genealogy. The word hit me like a slap. Michael had mentioned the same thing last night. Ryan wasn't just digging into family history for fun. He was looking for something. "Did he say why?" I pressed, keeping my tone casual. She hesitated, her gaze flicking away. "He said it's important to understand your roots, that knowing the truth can set you free." Her voice softened, and she looked back at me, her eyes searching mine. "Dad, is something going on? He's been acting different." Different was an understatement. Ryan had always been confident, even arrogant at times, but this was something else entirely. This was deliberate, calculated. "Has he ever said anything to you about me?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. "About our family?" Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "No, not really." "Why?" Before I could answer, Emily's voice cut through the air, sharp and intrusive. "There you are," she said, stepping into the room with a forced smile. "Lily, I need your help in the kitchen." Lily glanced between us, clearly sensing the tension, but she nodded. "Sure." She stood, throwing me a questioning look before following Emily out of the room. As soon as they were gone, I pulled out my phone and opened my email. Last night, after speaking with Michael, I had submitted a request to a private clinic for a DNA testing kit to be delivered to the house. I needed answers, real answers. If Ryan had uncovered something, I had to know what it was before he used it against me. Underscore, 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 underscore. The kit arrived that afternoon in discreet packaging. I tucked it away in my study, carefully planning my next move. Emily hovered around the house, her gaze sharp and suspicious. She knew I was up to something, but I didn't care. She had set this in motion, and now she would have to live with the consequences. That evening, I called Michael into my study. He entered reluctantly, his usual slouch more pronounced than ever. "What's up, Dad?" he asked, his tone cautious. I gestured for him to sit, keeping my expression neutral. "I've been thinking about your health. You've seemed a little run down lately, and I want to make sure everything's okay." He raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. I'm fine. Just stressed with work. Humor me, I said, handing him the kit. It's a quick test, just a saliva sample. It'll help put my mind at ease. Michael hesitated, eyeing the kit warily. This is weird. It's just routine, I lied smoothly. Nothing to worry about. After a moment, he sighed and took the kit. Fine, if it'll make you feel better. Thanks, I said, keeping my tone light. You're doing me a favor. Once he left, I carefully labeled his sample and set it aside. One down, one to go. The next morning, I intercepted Lily as she was heading out the door. Lily, wait, I called, holding the second kid in my hand. Can you do me a quick favor? She paused, her expression puzzled. What is it? It's for a health study I'm participating in, I said, keeping my tone casual. Just a saliva sample. It'll take 2 seconds. She blinked, surprised, but obliging. Sure, I guess. She handed me the completed sample a moment later. Let me know if it's anything serious. I will, I promised, watching as she drove off. With both samples in hand, I packaged them carefully and arranged for an overnight courier to deliver them to the clinic. The results couldn't come fast enough. That evening, I found Emily waiting for me in the living room. Her arms were crossed, her expression a mix of anger and unease. What are you doing, Paul? She asked, her voice low. I leaned against the doorframe, my gaze steady. What I should have done a long time ago, finding out the truth. Her eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. You don't need to do this, she said, stepping closer. It won't change anything. No, Emily, I said coldly. It changes everything, and you know it. She took another step forward, her voice trembling. Paul, please, don't tear this family apart. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. The family was already broken, Emily. You just didn't want to admit it. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought she might argue. But instead, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the quiet of the house. That night, as I sat in my study, I stared at the 2 labeled samples on my desk. The silence around me was suffocating, but I didn't care. The truth was coming, whether Emily, Ryan, or anyone else liked it or not. And when it did, I would finally have the answers I needed. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control. Ryan thought he could dismantle me, but he didn't realize how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine. This wasn't just about Ryan anymore. It was about the entire family. As I sealed the envelope containing the samples and set it aside for the courier, I felt a strange sense of calm. The unraveling had begun, but I was ready. Whatever truths lay ahead, I would face them. And when the dust settled, I would make sure no one could threaten what I had built ever again. Chapter 4: The Cracks Widen. The following morning arrived heavy with anticipation. My nerves were strung tight, every hour stretching painfully as I waited for the clinic to process the DNA results. The air in the house felt charged, as though the weight of unspoken truths was suffocating everyone under its roof. Emily avoided me entirely. I caught glimpses of her in the kitchen or on the phone, but she refused to make eye contact or exchange more than a few clipped words. Michael had holed himself up in his room, and Lily hadn't been home since the night before, likely finding solace in her friends or her work. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed, the alert snapping me out of my restless thoughts. I grabbed it off the table, my heart racing as I saw the subject line of the email. Your results are ready. For a moment, I hesitated. The envelope was open, the contents waiting to dismantle or confirm the foundation of my life. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before clicking the link. The page loaded, and the words swam before my eyes, each line more devastating than the last. Lily, not a biological match. Michael, not a biological match. The words hit me like a sledgehammer, each one chiseling away at the illusion I had clung to for decades. Neither Lily nor Michael were mine. My stomach churned, and I leaned back in my chair, the room spinning around me. It wasn't just Ryan. None of them were my children. A cold realization settled over me. Emily had lied to me for years, stringing me along in a web of deceit. Every sacrifice I had made, every opportunity one had passed up for the sake of my family, it was all built on a lie. I stared at the results for what felt like hours, my mind replaying every moment of the past night, every interaction with Emily, every smug smile from Ryan. He had known. He had known everything, and his toast had been a calculated strike. He wanted to see me crumble, and now he had the satisfaction of knowing he had succeeded. But as the anger boiled within me, it was joined by something colder and sharper, resolve. Ryan thought he held all the power, but he underestimated me. This wasn't over. That evening, I sat in the dining room, nursing a glass of scotch as I replayed the past few days in my mind. The house was eerily quiet, as though it too was bracing for the fallout. Emily entered the room cautiously, her gaze flickering to the glass in my hand before settling on my face. "You've been distant," she said, her voice soft but guarded. I looked up at her, my eyes narrowing. "Have I?" She shifted uncomfortably, her hands fidgeting. "What's going on, Paul?" "You've been acting strange." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the silence. "Strange? That's an interesting choice of words coming from you." Her expression faltered, a flicker of panic crossing her face. "What are you talking about?" I stood, setting the glass down with deliberate care. "Don't play dumb, Emily." "Not now." "I know." Her breath hitched, and she took a step back. "You all know what?" "Everything," I said coldly, my voice steady. "Lily. Michael. Right. They're not mine." Her face paled, her hands trembling. "Paula, don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult me by pretending you didn't know." Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "I was going to tell you," she whispered. "When?" I demanded, my voice rising. "When Ryan decided to humiliate me in front of everyone. When it became impossible to keep the truth buried." "You've had decades to tell me, Emily." "Decades." She sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she murmured. "Then how was it supposed to happen?" I asked, my voice dripping with venom. "Were you planning to keep the lie going until I died? Let me go to my grave believing this family was mine?" Her silence was answer enough. By the time Emily retreated to the bedroom, leaving me alone in the dining room, my mind was already racing with plans. I needed to confront Ryan directly. If he wanted to play this game, he needed to know that I wasn't going to crumble under the weight of his revelations. At exactly 7 p.m., I called Ryan. He answered on the second ring, his voice laced with smug amusement. "Didn't think I'd hear from you so soon." "We need to talk," I said, keeping my tone measured. "Do we?" he replied, feigning disinterest. "Yes," I said firmly. "Tomorrow. My office. 8 o'clock sharp." There was a pause, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. "Fine," he said finally. "But I'm not sure you're going to like what I have to say." "Likewise," I replied before hanging up. The next morning, I arrived at my office early, meticulously arranging the space for the confrontation. The DNA results sat in a folder on my desk, alongside a decanter of whiskey and 2 glasses. I wanted everything to be deliberate, every detail calculated. Ryan arrived precisely on time, his confidence evident in the way he strolled into the room. He closed the door behind him and took a seat across from me, his expression smug. "Dad," he said, the word dripping with mockery. "This is cozy." I ignored the jab, sliding the folder across the desk. "Open it." He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What's this?" "Another one of your lectures." "Just open it," I said sharply. Ryan flipped open the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "DNA test," he said, his voice hardening. "Yes," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Proof that none of you are mine." He closed the folder and leaned back, his confidence quickly returning. "And? What are you going to do about it?" I stood, pouring myself a glass of whiskey. "That depends on you." He laughed, the sound bitter. "You think this changes anything? You've built your entire life on lies, Dad. Your legacy is a joke." I turned to face him, my expression cold. "And what do you think your legacy will be, Ryan?" A man who tore his family apart for his own amusement? A liar and a thief. His jaw tightened, his composure cracking. This isn't about me. Oh, but it is, I said, stepping closer. You think you've won, but you've underestimated me. This isn't over, Ryan. Not by a long shot. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He had played his hand, but now he was beginning to realize that I still had cards of my own. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was a war. And I was ready to fight. Chapter 5. A House Divided. The tension that had been simmering finally erupted after my confrontation with Ryan. He had left my office with his confidence shaken, but I knew better than to think the fight was over. Ryan wasn't the type to back down, especially when he believed he held the upper hand. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't the same man who had sat silently at the reunion, blindsided by his smug toast. I was ready for this battle, and I wasn't going to lose. When I returned home that evening, the house felt like a battlefield. Emily sat in the living room, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance. Michael was nowhere to be found, and Lily had returned, though she avoided meeting my eyes as she passed me in the hallway. I knew the storm brewing inside these walls was about to break. Paul, Emily began as I entered the room. Her voice was soft, but there was a tension beneath it. We need to talk. I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed. About what? The years of lies? Or the fact that Ryan seems to think he can tear this family apart without consequences? She flinched at my words, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I never wanted this to happen, she said. You have to believe me. Do I? I snapped. Because I don't know what to believe anymore, Emily. You've lied to me for decades. You let me live a lie. You let me think this family was mine. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let it soften me. Not this time. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered. I thought I could protect you. Protect me? I barked a laugh, the sound bitter. You didn't protect me, Emily. You protected yourself. You let me sacrifice everything for this family, knowing it wasn't mine. She looked down, her shoulders trembling. For a moment, I thought she might offer an apology, but instead, she said, They're still your children, Paul. You raised them. You're their father in every way that matters. I shook my head, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Don't you dare try to justify this. Don't you dare tell me that this is okay. Before she could respond, Lily appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. What's going on? She asked, her voice trembling. Why are you two yelling? Emily and I exchanged a look, and I saw the panic in her eyes. She didn't want this conversation to happen, not yet, not like this. But I was done hiding the truth. Lily, I said, turning to her. We need to talk. There's something you need to know. Emily stood abruptly, her hands raised. Oh, please. Don't what? Lily asked, her gaze darting between us. What's going on? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The truth, Lily. It's time you knew the truth. We sat in the living room, the tension so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on all of us. Lily perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Emily sat beside her, her expression pleading, while I stood across from them, my arms crossed. What truth? Lily asked again, her voice shaking. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to tell her, but because I knew the words would change everything. Lily, I began, my voice steady. I ran some tests. DNA tests. Her brow furrowed, confusion crossing her face. Why? What kind of tests? Paternity tests, I said. I needed to know the truth about this family. Emily covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Lily's eyes widened, her confusion giving way to fear. What are you saying? She whispered. I looked directly at her, my heart pounding. I'm saying that you're not my biological daughter, Lily. Neither is Michael. Neither is Ryan. The words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Lily stared at me, her face pale, her lips trembling. That's not possible, she said, shaking her head. You're my dad. You've always been my dad. I raised you, I said. I was there for every moment, every milestone, But biologically, no, I'm not your father. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she turned to Emily. Mom, is this true? Emily didn't answer immediately. When she finally looked up, her face was streaked with tears. Lilia, is it true? Lily demanded, her voice rising. Yes, Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It's true. Lily stood abruptly, her hands trembling. How could you? She cried. How could you lie to us? To Dad? To everyone? Emily reached for her, but Lily stepped back, shaking her head. Don't, she said. Just don't. By the time Lily stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, Emily was a wreck. She sat on the couch, her head in her hands, sobbing quietly. I didn't feel sorry for her, not anymore. This was her mess, and now she had to live with the consequences. Are you happy now? She asked through her tears. No, I said coldly. But at least the truth is out. Her sobs grew louder, but I turned away, heading for my study. I needed to think, to plan my next move. Ryan wasn't finished, and neither was I. Later that night, I sat in my study, staring at the family photos on my desk. The faces that had once brought me so much pride now felt like strangers. I had spent decades building a life around a lie, and now the cracks were impossible to ignore. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up to see Michael standing in the doorway, his expression hesitant. Can I come in? He asked. I nodded, gesturing for him to take a seat. He walked in slowly, sitting across from me with his hands clasped tightly together. Lily told me, he said after a long silence, about the tests. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. And I don't know what to say, he admitted, his voice soft. I feel lost, like everything I thought I knew isn't real anymore. I understand, I said quietly, but you're still my son, Michael. Nothing changes that. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Doesn't it, though? I mean, you're not my dad. Not really. I raised you, I said firmly. I was there for you every step of the way. That's what matters. Michael nodded slowly, though his expression remained conflicted. I don't know how to feel about any of this. Take your time, I said, but just know that I'm still here. For you. For Lily. For this family. He gave me a small, tentative nod before standing. Thanks, Dad. As he left the room, I felt a flicker of hope. The truth had shattered us, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild. Chapter 6, The Fallout. The days that followed were a blur of tension, anger, and silence. The truth had unraveled the carefully constructed image of our family, leaving behind a fractured reality that none of us knew how to navigate. Emily avoided me entirely, retreating to the guest bedroom under the pretense of giving everyone space. Michael oscillated between quiet resentment and hesitant conversations, while Lily barely emerged from her room. As for Ryan, he was ominously quiet. I knew that silence was dangerous. It was mid-morning when I received a message from Ryan. We need to talk. 8 p.m. at the old house. Just us. The old house. The one where Emily and I had started our lives together, where we'd built what I thought was a future worth fighting for. The house had been empty for years, sold off after we moved to the city. Why would Ryan want to meet there? His choice of location wasn't random. It was a message, a power move, and I wasn't about to back down. At exactly 8 p.m., I pulled up to the driveway of the old house. It was strange seeing it again, its once vibrant exterior now weathered and worn. The lawn, once perfectly manicured, was overgrown, and the porch sagged with age. The place felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by memories of what could have been. Ryan's car was already parked outside, his sleek black sedan a stark contrast to the decaying house. I stepped out of my car, the crisp evening air biting at my skin as I approached the front door. Ryan stood inside, leaning casually against the old staircase, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. Dad, he greeted me, his tone mocking. Glad you could make it. What's this about, Ryan? I asked, stepping inside. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and decay. He gestured to the living room, where two chairs sat facing each other, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses on a small table between them. I thought we could have a civilized conversation, man to man. I didn't move. Say what you need to say, Ryan. He sighed, shaking his head as he walked to the table and poured himself a drink. Always so serious, aren't you? He took a sip, his eyes never leaving mine. Fine. Let's skip the pleasantries. You've been playing detective, haven't you? Digging up old secrets. I had to, I said evenly. Since you decided to blindside me at the reunion. He laughed, to sound bitter. Blindside you? Please. I just gave you a taste of your own medicine. What are you talking about? I demanded, my patience wearing thin. You've been lying to us for years, he said, his voice cold, pretending to be this noble, selfless father. But you're not. You're a fraud. I raised you, I shot back. I sacrificed everything for this family. Don't you dare call me a fraud. You sacrificed, he repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Spare me the martyr act, Dad. You didn't do it for us. You did it to feed your own ego. To feel like the hero. My fists clenched at my sides. Is that what you think? That I built this family for my own benefit? I don't think, Ryan said, his voice rising. I know. You let us live a lie, and now you're angry because I had the guts to expose it. I stepped closer, my voice low but dangerous. You didn't expose anything, Ryan. You took your mother's lies and weaponized them to hurt everyone around you. That doesn't make you brave. It makes you cruel. For the first time, his composure faltered. You don't know what it's like, he said, his voice cracking. Growing up in your shadow, feeling like I could never measure up. And then to find out you're not even my real father. And you think this is the way to handle it. I countered. By tearing everyone else down with you. He looked away, his jaw tightening. You don't get it. Then help me understand, I said. Tell me what you're trying to accomplish. He turned back to me, his eyes blazing. I want you to admit it. Admit that you're not the perfect father. Admit that you're just as flawed as the rest of us. I stared at him, my chest heaving with anger and frustration. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't spent years questioning every decision I've made? I'm not perfect, Ryan. I never claimed to be. But I tried. I did my best. Your best wasn't good enough, he said, his voice cold. And what about you? I shot back. What have you done to make this family better? To lift anyone up instead of dragging them down? He didn't answer, his silence speaking volumes. The standoff ended with Ryan storming out, slamming the door behind him. I stayed behind, sinking into one of the dusty chairs as the weight of the confrontation pressed down on me. Ryan's anger was a fire that threatened to consume everything in its path, but beneath it, I saw something else, pain. He wasn't just angry at me, he was angry at the world for a truth he didn't know how to process. As I sat in the silence of the old house, I realized that this battle wasn't just about lies or betrayal. It was about identity, about what it meant to be a family. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if we would survive it. Back at home, the tension hadn't eased. Emily was waiting for me in the living room, her arms crossed and her expression guarded. You met with him, didn't you? She asked. Yes, I said, too exhausted to argue. I did. And she pressed. He's angry, I said. At me. At you. At everything. She sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping. I never wanted this to happen, she murmured. But it did, I said firmly. And now we have to deal with it. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. Paula, don't. I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Not tonight. She nodded silently, retreating to the guest bedroom without another word. I poured myself another drink, sitting alone in the dimly lit living room as the house settled into uneasy silence. The next morning, I woke to find an envelope on the dining room table, my name scrawled on the front in Ryan's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a copy of the DNA results I had shown him, with a handwritten note at the bottom. This isn't over. I stared at the note, my jaw tightening. Ryan wasn't done, and I couldn't afford to let my guard down. He was playing a dangerous game, and I needed to be ready for whatever move he made next. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting what was left of this family and reclaiming the life I had spent decades building. The war wasn't over, but I was determined to win. Chapter 7: The Unraveling. Ryan's cryptic note lingered in my mind like a splinter. This isn't over. The words weren't a warning, they were a promise. Whatever Ryan was planning, it wouldn't be subtle, and it wouldn't be merciful. The calm before the storm had passed, and I could feel the tempest looming. The next few days were strained. Emily continued her silent retreat, skulking around the house like a ghost. Lily barely spoke to anyone, avoiding me entirely, while Michael oscillated between uneasy acceptance and quiet resentment. The house felt like it was on the brink of collapse, every conversation laced with unspoken tension. I knew Ryan was biding his time. He wanted me to feel the weight of anticipation, the uncertainty of when and how he would strike. But I wasn't going to let him dictate the narrative. If he wanted to wage war, I would meet him head-on. It was late one evening when the first cracks in Ryan's plan began to show. My phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. "Your son has been asking questions. Call me." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The message was unsigned, but something about it felt legitimate. I dialed the number immediately, my hands trembling as I held the phone to my ear. A man's voice answered, deep and measured. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes." "Who is this?" "My name's Thomas Gray. I'm an attorney," he said. "Your son, Ryan, reached out to me a few months ago regarding some sensitive matters." "What kind of matters?" I demanded, though I already had a sinking feeling in my stomach. "Paternity," Gray replied. He wanted to know the legal implications of contesting inheritance if paternity was disproven. I clenched the phone tighter, my jaw tightening. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him the truth," Gray said. "Paternity doesn't negate the legal standing of an inheritance unless there's a formal challenge. But, Mr. Carter, your son seemed determined." He wasn't just asking hypothetical questions. He had a goal in mind. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, suspicion creeping into my tone. "Because I don't want to be part of a family war," Gray said simply. Ryan seemed unstable, angry. "I thought you should know." I thanked him and ended the call, my mind racing. Ryan wasn't just playing games. He was making calculated moves to dismantle everything I had built, starting with the family's finances. He wanted to strip me of control, to force me into submission. But if he thought I would go down without a fight, he was mistaken. The next morning, I decided it was time to confront Emily. She had been complicit in Ryan's behavior for too long, her silence enabling him to act unchecked. I found her in the kitchen, sipping coffee and staring out the window. "We need to talk," I said, my tone firm. She turned to me, her expression weary. "Paul, I can't do this right now." "You don't have a choice," I snapped. "Ryan is spiraling out of control, and you're the only one who can stop him." She set her coffee down, her hands trembling slightly. "What do you want me to do?" "He doesn't listen to me." "He listens to you more than you think," I said. "He knows about the paternity tests. He knows everything. And now he's trying to destroy this family." Emily's face paled. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, debating how much to reveal. "He's been talking to lawyers, looking into ways to challenge inheritance. He wants to tear me down, and you're the one who gave him the ammunition." Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "Paul, I didn't mean for this to happen." "I didn't want." "You didn't want what?" I interrupted. "For your lies to come back to haunt you? For the truth to finally surface?" She flinched at my words but didn't argue. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted quietly. "Start by talking to him," I said. "Make him see reason before he does something irreversible." Later that day, I received an email from my private investigator, the one I had hired after Ryan's toast set this chain of events into motion. Attached were financial records, phone logs, and surveillance photos. Ryan had been busy. Over the past 6 months, he had been siphoning funds from one of my lesser-used accounts, funneling the money into his own ventures. He wasn't just trying to undermine me. He was actively stealing from me. I stared at the documents, a cold rage building in my chest. Ryan thought he was untouchable, but he was wrong. He had left a trail, and now I had the proof I needed to expose him for the liar and thief he was. That evening, I called a family meeting. Emily, Michael, and Lily gathered in the living room, their expressions a mix of confusion and apprehension. Ryan was conspicuously absent, but I wasn't surprised. He was avoiding me, likely preparing for his next move. "Where's Ryan?" I asked, my gaze sweeping over the room. Emily fidgeted, her eyes darting toward the door. "He said he was busy." "Of course he did," I muttered. I turned to face them, holding up the folder of evidence. "There's something you all need to know." I laid everything out: the DNA results, Ryan's attempts to challenge inheritance, and the stolen funds. Michael and Lily listened in stunned silence, their disbelief etched across their faces. Emily sat with her head bowed, her guilt palpable. "This is what your brother has been doing," I said, my voice hard. "He's not just angry, he's malicious. And I won't stand for it." Michael was the first to speak, his voice shaky. "But why? Why would Ryan do this?" "Because he's angry," I said. "Angry at me, at Emily, at the truth. And instead of dealing with it like an adult, he's lashing out." Lily buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "This family is falling apart," she whispered. "It doesn't have to," I said firmly. "But we need to stand together. We can't let Ryan tear us apart." Emily finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "What are you going to do, Paul?" I met her gaze, my expression steely. "I'm going to confront him. And I'm going to end this." The following day, I called Ryan, demanding a meeting. He agreed reluctantly, setting the location at a private restaurant downtown. When I arrived, he was already there, seated at a corner table with a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked up as I approached, his smirk firmly in place. "Dad," he said, his tone mocking. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I sat across from him, sliding the folder of evidence across the table. "You've gone too far, Ryan. Ends now." He opened the folder, his smirk fading as he scanned the contents. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low. "Does it matter?" I shot back. "You've been stealing from me, lying to your siblings, and trying to destroy everything I've built. But you're not going to win." Ryan leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "You think this scares me? You think you can stop me?" "I don't need to scare you," I said coldly. "I just need to expose you. And trust me, Ryan, once everyone knows the truth, you'll have nothing left." He glared at me, his fists clenched. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Yes, it is," I replied, standing. "And you've already lost." Chapter 8: The Final Blow. The confrontation with Ryan left a bitter taste in my mouth. His defiance was predictable, but it still stung to see how far he was willing to go to tear everything apart. As I left the restaurant, the weight of what I needed to do pressed heavily on my shoulders. The truth was out now, and I had to take control of the situation before Ryan could do more damage. When I returned home, Emily was waiting for me in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as I entered, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Well," she asked, her voice trembling. "How did it go?" I set the folder of evidence down on the coffee table and sat across from her. "Ryan isn't backing down. He's determined to burn everything to the ground if it means getting what he wants." Emily closed her eyes, her face crumpling as she let out a shaky breath. "I don't know what to do anymore, Paul. He won't listen to me." "He doesn't need to listen," I said coldly. "He needs to face the consequences." Her eyes snapped open, panic flickering across her face. "What are you going to do?" "I've already done it," I replied. "I've handed everything over to the authorities, his forgery, the stolen funds, all of it. They'll handle him now." Emily's face paled further, and she shook her head. "You didn't." "I did," I said firmly. "He crossed the line, Emily. This isn't just about family anymore. It's about accountability." "You're going to ruin him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's your son. He's your son," I snapped, the words harsher than I intended. "And he made his choices." Emily flinched, her tears spilling over as she buried her face in her hands. I stood and walked out of the room, the sound of her sobs following me down the hallway. The next morning, the tension in the house was palpable. Michael and Lily avoided me, their unease growing as the fallout from Ryan's actions became impossible to ignore. Emily barely spoke, retreating further into herself with each passing hour. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts, and I opened it to find two police officers standing on the porch. "Mr. Paul Carter," one of them asked. "Yes," I said, my heart pounding. "We're here to speak with Ryan Carter," the officer continued. "Is he home?" "No," I replied, "but I can't tell you where to find him." As I gave them Ryan's address, Emily appeared in the hallway, her face pale and stricken. "Paul, what's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. I didn't answer her, instead turning back to the officers. "You'll find everything you need in the evidence I submitted." The officers nodded, thanking me before heading back to their car. As they drove away, Emily rounded on me, her eyes blazing with fury. "How could you?" she demanded. "How could you do this to him?" "I didn't do this to him," I shot back. "He did this to himself." "He's your son," she cried, her voice breaking. "You're supposed to protect him." "I protected him for as long as I could," I said coldly. "But he made his choice, Emily, and now he has to live with it." The fallout came quickly. Ryan was arrested later that day, charged with forgery, theft, and fraud. The news spread like wildfire, his once sterling reputation crumbling under the weight of his actions. I watched the coverage from the living room, a mix of emotions churning inside me. Satisfaction, anger, sadness. Michael and Lily were silent as they watched the news with me, their expressions unreadable. Emily sat off to the side, her face buried in her hands. None of us spoke, the weight of what had happened hanging heavily in the air. That evening, Lily finally broke the silence. She approached me in the study, her face pale but determined. "Dad," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Can we talk?" I looked up from the paperwork scattered across my desk and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated before sinking into the chair across from me. "I've been thinking about everything," she began, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "About Ryan. About all of this." I waited, sensing she had more to say. "I'm angry," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Angry at Ryan, at Mom, at you. But I'm also scared. I don't know what's going to happen to us now." I leaned forward, my gaze steady. "Lily, I know this has been hard, harder than anything we've ever faced. But we'll get through it. I promise you that." She nodded slowly, tears spilling over as she wiped them away. "I want to believe that, Dad. I really do." "You're strong," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "Stronger than you realize. And no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." She gave me a small, tentative smile before standing. "Thanks, Dad." As she left the room, I felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild. Later that night, Emily approached me, her expression weary but determined. "I don't agree with what you did," she said, her voice steady. "But I understand why you did it." "That's a start," I replied, my tone clipped. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "Do you think we can ever fix this?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think we owe it to ourselves to try." She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm sorry, Paul. For everything." I didn't respond immediately, the weight of her words settling over me. "Sorry won't fix this," I said finally. "But it's a start." As she left the room, I sat alone in the quiet of the house, my thoughts churning. The family I thought I had built was gone, replaced by something fractured and uncertain. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild, not on lies, but on truth. The war with Ryan was over, but the scars it left would take time to heal. And as I stared out into the dark night, I resolved to do whatever it took to protect what was left of my family. Chapter 9: Rebuilding the Ruins. The days following Ryan's arrest were quieter, but the silence in the house was heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. The television remained off, conversations were brief, and meals were eaten in solitude. It felt like we were all walking through the aftermath of a storm, trying to piece together what was left. Emily moved carefully around me, her guilt hanging between us like an invisible barrier. Lily and Michael kept their distance, though Michael occasionally ventured into my study to ask questions or just sit quietly in my presence. It wasn't much, but it was something. Ryan, meanwhile, had lawyered up. Through his attorney, I received word that he intended to fight the charges, though the evidence against him was overwhelming. I wasn't sure what hurt more, betrayal or the fact that even now he refused to take responsibility for his actions. One afternoon, I found Lily sitting on the porch, her knees tucked to her chest as she stared out at the empty street. I stepped outside, the creak of the wooden floorboards announcing my presence. She didn't turn to look at me, but shifted slightly, leaving space on the step beside her. "Mind if I join you?" I asked. She shook her head, and I lowered myself onto the step, the cool breeze brushing against my face. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The quiet felt fragile, as though one wrong word might shatter it. "I miss him," Lily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at her, surprised. "Ryan." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Even after everything he's done, he's still my brother." I reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. "I understand. He's still my son, too, even if he doesn't feel like it right now." She turned to me, her face crumpling. "Do you think he hates us?" "No," I said firmly. "I think he's angry. At me. At your mother. Maybe even at himself. But hate? No, that's not who Ryan is." She nodded, wiping her tears away with the sleeve of her sweater. "I don't know how we come back from this. One step at a time," I said. "We can't undo what's happened, but we can try to move forward." "Do you think he'll ever forgive us?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think the more important question is whether we can forgive him." The next day, I decided it was time to have a real conversation with Michael. I found him in the garage, tinkering with the same old bike he'd been trying to fix for months. He looked up when I entered, his expression guarded. "Hey," I said, leaning against the doorway. "Hey," he replied, his hand still working on the rusted chain. "Got a minute?" I asked. He hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. What's up?" I stepped inside, taking a seat on an overturned crate. I wanted to talk about everything that's happened. I know it's been a lot to process. Michael set his tools down, his shoulders slumping. "You can say that again. I want you to know something," I said, my voice steady. "No matter what the DNA tests say, you're my son. That's never going to change." He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine. "How can you say that? After everything?" "Because being a father isn't about biology," I said. "It's about showing up. It's about being there when it matters. And I've been here for you every step of the way." He nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I know. I feel like I don't know who I am anymore." "You're Michael Carter," I said. "My son. Lily's brother. Ryan's too, whether he likes it or not. That hasn't changed." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Thanks, Dad." "Always," I said. As the weeks turned into months, the cracks in our family began to mend, though the scars remained. Emily and I started having honest conversations, painful, raw conversations about the past, about the lies, and about what we wanted for the future. There were no easy answers, but we were trying, and that was enough for now. Lily began opening up more, slowly returning to the vibrant, confident woman she had been before all of this. Michael, too, seemed to find a sense of stability, diving into a new project at work and spending more time at home. Ryan, however, remained a thorn in my side. His legal battles were ongoing, though the evidence against him was damning. Despite everything, I found myself hoping he would find a way to come back from this, to take accountability and rebuild his life. He was still my son, after all, even if the bond between us felt irreparably strained. One evening, as I sat in my study, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it, my breath catching as I read the message. "I'm sorry." It was from Ryan. I stared at the screen, my emotions swirling. It wasn't much, just 2 words. But it was a start. I replied simply, "So am I." The house was quieter now. But it was a different kind of quiet. Not the suffocating silence of betrayal, but the peaceful quiet of a family learning to rebuild. The photos on the mantle still felt like relics of another time, but I didn't take them down. They were a reminder of where we had been and of how far we still had to go. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, I stood on the porch, watching the sky burn with shades of orange and pink. Emily joined me, standing silently by my side. For the first time in months, it didn't feel like we were worlds apart. "We'll be okay," she said softly. I nodded, though I didn't reply. Deep down, I knew she was right. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But we would find a way to move forward. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, I felt a strange sense of peace. The life I thought I had built was gone, replaced by something messier, something more honest. And for the first time, I was okay with that.